Welcome to Economics and Beyond. I'm Rob Johnson, president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Former NBA champion, point guard with the Detroit Pistons, very active in the business world. He's been in the management area of the NBA, working with Toronto, working in Indiana, working with New York, the New York Knicks. He's also been involved in the Women's Basketball Association with the New York Liberty, and more recently has been in the champagne business with Sherlon Champagne and a number of other things, including a philanthropic organization called Mary's Court and a new cannabis company, CBD oils, and things that perhaps he can explain to us in the conversation today. Thanks for joining me, Isiah.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And I think, I guess we start here on the 19th of May for this conversation. In the middle of this lockdown, in the middle of this pandemic, you come from the west side of Chicago. You spent a lot of years in Detroit, which is my hometown. You're seeing things from business point of view, from the world of sports entertainment, and from the world I know of being a very caring individual. What what concerns you? What do you see? What would you like to see done in the face of this challenge in the United States and around the world?
Well, this is a very difficult time for so many people emotionally, uh, and and also financially. When you have so many people out of work, and and the emotions of depression, not being able to support your family the way you normally would be accustomed to. I think there needs to be definitely more focus on helping the underserved communities or the disadvantaged communities, and making sure that not only do they get through the pandemic, but when we come out of the pandemic, that there are enough skills, jobs available for them to get back into the economy. Those are the things that concern me the most. The virus. I do believe that at some point in time, I'm hopeful that we'll find a cure. But until we find a cure, uh, I think it's important that we really look after and take care of the people who are disadvantaged in our society, and try to make sure that um, you know the underserved communities can really thrive in these times.
And do you see a particular uh, pathway to that? We've seen, I guess it's in the neighborhood of $3 trillion being allocated by the Congress, largely to big financial institutions and large corporate entities. And my concern is that while fortifying those institutions may be necessary to keeping the economy, I would say, from really cratering, I'm worried that the dissemination or the diffusion of those resources won't reach many of the communities that you refer to in the underserved parts of America.
The name of your podcast is New Economic Thinking, and um, the what the pandemic has brought to us and forced upon us is a way to recognize that we have to think differently about the way we employ resources, disperse resources, and who has access to resources. And although we've flooded the economy with trillions of dollars, and we've propped up institutions and markets, um, we what we failed to see and do in my observation is that you know the human psyche is going to be different coming out of COVID, just like the human psyche was different coming out of 9/11. Uh, Things are going to change. They're going to change drastically, and there's some industries that are not going to come back. But what will be here is people and the human factor, and in terms of investing in the human factor and what he or she is currently and what he or she can become and be from a skill set standpoint, introducing uh, new skills, new ways of learning, to be ready for uh, the the next economy. uh, i I don't know if the old economy, the way it used to be in terms of people traveling, moving around, the things that we took for granted, so to speak. Uh, there's going to be a change, and I think preparing our society for that change that's going to come and helping influence in that change through economics, through communication and resources. I think that's the key.
Yeah, I think, I can see just from the standpoint of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, the whole mode of strategy for disseminating the works that we sponsor, the research, the kernels of new economic thinking, or even the fomenting of critical discourse, not necessarily knowing what the right thing is, but opening the conversation to be broadened in light of the unmasking that the pandemic has brought to life, just as you suggest, in some of the human failings. But I look at even my own staff now, and the work that we do is much more electronically based. I have a group called the Young Scholars Initiative with roughly 11,000 members around the world. They were planning to do a big conference in Budapest, Hungary in September. That's canceled. And now they're talking about doing a rolling global electronic conference. And watching them assimilate the skills necessary to execute such a plan, or even watching my daughter Sarah in fifth grade and Dylan in second grade assimilate the technical skills to go to school via an iPad. And Isaiah, as you know, because you know my wife and family, I mean, we're among the advantaged. We can work with our children, with the school, with the resources. But I'm concerned that with all these changes, and I think they are irreversible changes, as you suggest, we've got to provide the tools and the support so that many people can, which you might call, rise to being productive and enthusiastic and hopeful in that context. Otherwise, we will have a very, I think, dangerous and despondent political environment deriving from a failed economics.
Uh, I agree with you, and the access to resources in terms of capital, um, technology, education. When we talk about, again, we flooded the economy with trillions of dollars, uh, but the the people who need help the most didn't have access to the banking institutions where you had to apply and be part of the system to actually receive the funds that were needed. Uh, so you the then the second layer of that was, okay, well, we'll give it to the the big businesses who employ all of the workers, and that's a way that we can actually distribute the funds. But what that really says is that we don't have access to the underbelly of our economy and of our society. And I look at this pandemic, and this was a perfect time with the resources in the economics of the money that was flooding into society, this was a perfect time to really uplift and level the playing field from the bottom. Because as the top was coming down, because of the pandemic, this was a good time to really raise the bottom and level the playing field. And now everyone coming out of COVID could have had an equal chance and an equal opportunity to pursue whatever the new economy is going to be. When you talk about education, we're looking at a school system now. We're looking at a lot of kids that don't have access to the technology or don't have access to the skills to know how to use the technology that's going to be required for the new world. Um, what do people do? How do we level the playing field? How do you get up to speed? And this would have been a great time for um, the Secretary of Education to step in, make sure that all of the underserved communities, populations, not only did not only should they have enough food, but also partnering with one of the major corporations to make sure that they put technology in the home so kids can have the opportunity to catch up and stay afloat, so to speak.
I think that that process it's a very I find it very interesting, Isaiah, because in the months before the pandemic, we saw things like the Business Roundtable saying shareholder maximization, only working for your stockholders, is too narrow. Even the leading business schools were now starting to say stakeholders are far beyond the narrow gains of those who own equity in a company. And we're seeing an awareness, what I would call, among those large institutions, those powerful institutions, that they have a responsibility of stewardship. But at the other end of the spectrum, what my wife, Alexis, has taught me about the psychology of what she calls otherness. And her business before she joined Planned Parenthood as the CEO was called perception.org. I believe your daughter worked with her in some contexts. And the problem I see is that the depth of otherness makes it very hard for those we might call well-meaning stewards to reach far enough and be as inclusive as we need in a society. And we need a change of consciousness about who belongs as a human in the face of this challenge.
Well, you touched on the key word, human, and if we start from that standpoint where we're all human and we're all equal, um, then you can really start to unravel. Excuse me. You can start to unravel, you know, um, America's lone systemic problem of race, racism, racialized language, and uh, criminalization of a certain um sector of people. And from a capitalistic standpoint, how does American ideas, values, goals in terms of the the dream of what America uh, was going to be and is growing into, still as a, a young democracy. How how do we not necessarily right the wrongs, but how do we come to the realization that uh, we're all equal and we're all human, and and how do we level the playing field so everyone has a shot at rising to the top? that's what the American dream is all about. And in this pandemic, I do think we had an opportunity to kind of level the playing field and rise the bottom up, so everyone can have a chance and have an equal shot at the American dream.
Yeah, at some level, we got to practice what we preach. Uh, I've heard some people discussing the nature of governance now that, uh, how would I say, through our founding documents, Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, there are some lofty declarations. And if we all together take those those documents as a beacon of what we want to be, then perhaps they serve a constructive purpose that when someone is not treated like those documents suggest our society should aspire to, it creates the basis for corrective action. But if we get to a place where, which you might call one who espouses those principles is considered a romantic fool and is mocked for being too sentimental or idealistic, then our republic ceases to have a direction. And in my own life, I grew up in Detroit. I can share with the audience and with you. When I was very young, Martin Luther King came and spoke at the school in suburban Detroit, in Grosse Pointe Park, that would be my high school. I was 11 years old at the time, but several years later, I'd go there, and that was 3 weeks to the day before he was killed. And my mother was involved with the school system, and my mother had supported letting him speak, and I had watched neighbors and members of the community attack my mother verbally for supporting letting him speak. And when he was killed, I remember sitting in front of my parents, and they were discussing whether we needed to evacuate our house and go someplace else because the unrest, and this was 1 year, of course, after the riots that we'd experienced in Detroit. But there was this, for me at 11 years old, I don't understand, except I understand it's important. And when I went to college, I minored in creative writing, and I studied the writings of Martin Luther King. And to come back to where I was earlier, Isaiah, he is a person who held our principles up to us and beckoned us to recognize that we were not treating the Black community as we were espousing as a country that we would treat humans. And I don't know who carries that banner today, but I do recall, in looking at the decline of Detroit in the economic sense, that in the aftermath of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts that Lyndon Johnson passed, Southern Democrats were not willing to come to the assistance of a Black governed, in the days of Coleman Young, in a Black majority population city. It was as if Detroit was demonized. It was as if Detroit was blamed as a victim. And the violence and the velocity of the decline of Detroit was almost like a scar on the American dream. It was terrifying. And the public relations was used to, how would I describe, to reassure the rest of America that Detroit was to blame for their own problems and that everyone else's American dream was intact. I think that false consciousness is what turned me into what I'll call a rebel economist and someone who seeks different or alternative or new economic thinking, because it was in such tension with the sense of humanity in the community in which I lived.
So two things that you touched on when you talk about um, the American dream, and the other is, can you know how do you govern now? How do you govern a society? And you know what what the classified Negro, Black, African American, Indian, the those who became classified as the other, so to speak. Um, you know the resistance and the fight to become a part of the United States of America, uh, in terms of law, in terms of voting, in terms of rights, in terms of membership. That's what the fight was all about, not to be classified. And I think America is coming to the point, or has come to the point, or one day hopefully it will come to the point, that you cannot govern by race. You can't. I just don't see that as a long lasting way to govern without having oppression in your governance. Uh, because if you got race, and you got black man, white man, blue man, red man, yellow, purple, green, all in they're classified in different classifications with different rights and privileges, um, then then the fight for equality will always be tearing at the fabric of what you're trying to build. So the day that we can all get to the point where we're human, as opposed to classified in these racial categories, and in these racial categories the stereotype of is stamped on top of that racial category, in that box that you put in. um, it's going to continue to be a problem that tears at the fabric of what America is trying to be.
Yes. Isaiah, I don't know this from personal experience, but I've known a number of executives that worked around in and around the National Basketball Association. And my, how do I say, my network of people, even before you and I had met, suggested that you have been very intensely involved in mentoring young players as they relate to what you might call the pressures of celebrity, wealth, in the context of race, in the context of the challenge of almost being a star and being an other at the same time. How do you see that challenge for a black athlete with extraordinary talent, just as you once were in the modern context?
Sports and entertainment, are two interesting places for, um, at one point in time, the classified Negro, and now the classified Black, or classified African American. Um, and what goes into sports and entertainment, in terms of what I try to counsel, is just understanding and recognizing the language that we use in these two spaces, in the language of the business model that we have to operate in sports and entertainment. And I don't mean this in a bad way, but it is what it is. It basically is a plantation business model applied to sport, and the language around sport and entertainment are basically slave plantation language. Now, when we talk about slave plantation language, let's not forget that um, while the classified blacks were slaves, there were also classified Irish, uh, classified, Poles. So everyone has had their bet, but however, the people of color have been oppressed the longest in this country. But that language, rises to the top in sports and entertainment. So the uh, when when you when you when you when you talk about being free or being drafted, being a free agent, um, the 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 language in the years of, of free agency, you're getting drafted, you're under contract. I mean, all these things in sports and entertainment. Okay, well, this language, this racialized language, has meaning, and it definitely carries outside of sport. So, uh, your wife, who worked, who started the Perception Institute. So those perceptions and that language, that racialized language, okay, it just doesn't stay in the arena. Now it moves outside of the playing field. And you know, when you talk about the stereotypes in the words and the usage of words that goes on in sports and entertainment, and then you move that into society, well, that becomes very, very problematic in terms of self identity, self awareness, um, and how you are perceived and looked at in society. So the words that are labeled and defined inside the arena, um, they do travel, and I think we have to be extremely conscious of that now, because sports and entertainment for the classified, African American, Black uh, person in terms of culture. Um, Now all culture is represented to the world, uh, mainly now through these two vehicles of sports and entertainment combined with pictures. And so we're in a very tricky place. So in terms of mentoring, I do try to educate in this space too, just to make sure that the players that I'm talking to about perception, the reality of the situation, and also their financial uh, well being. I try to touch on all of those things to make sure that they have a clear view of what they're walking into and how to navigate in this system that we find ourselves in.
I think that's a tremendous service that you provide because, well, just in the context, say, of the NBA, in addition to performing in the sport, all the endorsements and all the commercial dimensions which can enhance your personal financial well-being often are marketed in the context of these unconscious biases and these norms that are quite unhealthy. And at the same time, these athletes become role models for young African Americans. And what they say and how they act has a tremendous amount of influence in what you might call the perpetuation of evil norms or the evolution of those norms. But that may, I would conjecture that that can come into some tension with the vitality of the endorsements that one can attract and sustain. If you're, but at least you're putting on the table the trade-offs and the consciousness that these people will have to grapple with in order to have a meaningful and successful life, in the sense of when they look in the mirror. You probably help a lot of people avoid doing things that they would later be ashamed of.
Well, the champion historically in sport and entertainment, uh, you know, for 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 the the race the race category that we've been put in, uh, that that champion or entertainer who has been fortunate enough to get the mic and have voice where he or she can speak to the masses, it was always important to the community that he or she who had the mic could speak for the voiceless, because the champion who had voice and was given the opportunity to to voice what he or she was feeling or seeing, um, you were more or less obligated, and that was your responsibility to speak for the voiceless. When the champion has the mic and a person of influence has the mic and he or she elects not to speak for the voiceless, uh, then, you know, bad things happen, in terms of health, education, and so forth and so on. That's what the history of in this country has shown, that when you don't have voice, and the champion in our particular field of sport and entertainment elects not to use his or her voice, then there have been serious consequences for that. So we love Muhammad Ali because he spoke for the voiceless, and we call Muhammad Ali the greatest, not because he was the greatest fighter. He could have been the greatest fighter. That's who knows. Um, but we say he's the greatest because of what he did in the ring and outside of the ring. That's what has given Muhammad Ali the long-lasting stature in our community, because he spoke for the voiceless.
Yes, yes, he's a very profound influence in my life. I happened to meet him when I worked for Senator William Proxmire of Wisconsin on the U.S. Senate Banking Committee, and about once a quarter, Ali would come in for lunch with Proxmire. And one day, my oldest daughter Natalie was with me. Her mother was in Japan, and Natalie was ill, and our nanny was ill, and I brought her to the office. And she was in my office, and she started to cry a little bit. She was about 2 at the time. And all of a sudden, this man appears around the corner, and he says, "Where's that baby? Where's that baby?" And then he looks, and I recognize, and I had known Muhammad Ali's going to see Bill Proxmire, but I never expected to see him right there at the door. When he picked her up and kissed her and held her for a while, and then he said, "Well, I hope you're free for lunch, because I'm going to go ask Senator Proxmire to add you and this girl. I want you to be in the room with us at lunch." And I just was spellbound. And I don't want to prolong the story, but about a year and a half later, I was in a grocery store in McLean, Virginia, with Natalie in a cart. And Muhammad Ali had a cookie called Champs And I guess he was doing a promotion. But all of a sudden, these lights are flashing, and this guy reached in and picked my daughter up.
Oh, no.
And then he looked at me and recognized in a superficial way, like we had encountered one another before. And he said, "I just had to come to pick up my girl," and everybody cheered.
That is
What a vital, vital, radiant human being,
yeah.
and a deep example. And the great man who studies mythology and story, Joseph Campbell. He wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And it's really about what historically constitutes a hero. He is known to have said, heroism is not born of calculation. It's born of doing something bigger than yourself, of risk taking, and of self sacrifice. And when Muhammad Ali gave up his title and stood up to the Vietnam War, among other things, but he really, really, he went to a place where my father used to say that will be the most remembered person in 100 years from our era. Just an extraordinary being.
Yeah, the sacrifices that he made, um, for to bring attention to the oppression that was happening in our communities, um, and he did risk it all in terms of giving up the prime the prime of his career. Those 2.5, 3 years, those were the prime of his career that he gave up. And you know, we as a community are forever grateful that he stood for something bigger than money, and stood for something bigger than winning a boxing match. He stood for uplifting humanity, uh, and you know, trying to make sure that we were all seen as equal in the eyes of the law and equal in this country.
Yes. Well, there's a famous story that's accounted for in the Guinness Book of World Records, where they claim that the shortest poem ever in history was created by Muhammad Ali when he was at Harvard University giving a speech. And when he got off the stage, someone from the audience said, "Ali, what about a poem?" And he stepped back up to the microphone and he looked at them and he said, "Me, we."
Hmm.
And that is the poem which conveys that broader awareness, that tension between the individual and the collective
Yep.
sensitivity. I've always been fascinated that is what emanated from him at that moment, and that kind of humility from someone who's been, how would I say, idolized. And he wrote a book late in his life. He had one child, a daughter, who he had not been close to in uh, raising her and nurturing her, who was a writer. And he wrote a book called The Soul of a Butterfly. And one of the things that I was so touched by is in the book, and he knew he was nearing the end of life, but in the book, he wanted to apologize or acknowledge things that he had done wrong. And the two things that he cited was that when Malcolm X had split from the Nation of Islam, he didn't stand with Malcolm X. He distanced from him. And the second was the way he thought, in the context of boxing and entertainment, he had teased Joe Frazier and realized subsequently that he had hurt Joe Frazier, and he was very apologetic about that. And just the depth of that humility I found very, very striking.
You know that. to me, that I find that the the champion like an Ali, um, you know, who understands that strength truly comes from being vulnerable and sometimes weak, or perceived as weak. It's you know understanding and knowing when to be forceful and when to be compassionate. That's that's the sign of ascending spiritually, and as they would say, becoming Christ-like, uh, in terms of that ascension and that movement, in terms of mind, and understanding the world that you live in and what the human spirit is truly all about. And Ali was able to capture that in so many ways at so many different times.
Well, I'm going to turn the lens onto another famous athlete who I've found inspiring, and it's the gentleman I'm speaking with right now. When I watched the Pistons in the finals against Portland, I saw a point guard who was the star and the leader of the team driving towards the basket in the deciding game. But when you drew all the attention, you threw the ball to Vinnie Johnson, and he scored the basket. You used, it was almost Zen like to me. You used your leadership and what you might call the magnet of ego to draw them away and provide the shot for somebody else when people probably would have thought that you as the star wanted to finish the job yourself. And I thought that was one of the most beautiful moments I ever saw in professional sports.
Well, I'm glad you felt that way, because when Benny made that shot, I thought it was a beautiful moment too.
Yeah, yeah. But
But,
it was so, it was like you used all the energies. And obviously he was a great shooter and you trusted him, but you didn't you didn't force it. You used that as a leader, as a playmaker. And it was like a beautiful revelation of a dimension of your greatness. And Isaiah, I'm not going to dwell on this ESPN program today that's showing right now on the Bulls, and the Bulls and Pistons rivalry is at the center. But I really admired when they talked about the Pistons walking off, and in subsequent interviews you've done in recent days, how you explained the context. It was not necessary to apologize, but you did say that you wish you had done things differently. And I'm going to make a joke out of this, but I admired that vulnerability and that openness and that strength in the context of the floodlight. And what I wanted to do as a Detroiter is call up Sidney Crosby of the Pittsburgh Penguins, and because they had played the Red Wings, and when they beat the Red Wings, and in hockey that was very formal, they had a line up and shook hands, and he didn't do it. And the Red Wings were having lost at home in Game 7, left the ice. And I wanted to call Sidney Crosby and show him that interview with you to see what he has to say about that time. And he may be apologetic. I'm not saying he's a bad guy, but you just set a great tone in your response, and it's consistent
well,
with the
thank
Ali, and it's consistent with the man who gave the ball to Vinnie Johnson, and it's consistent with the gentle, strong man that I've gotten to know through my wife.
well, thank you for that. And um, again, in sport, what sport really teaches you is how to connect, mind and body, and have a certain control of emotions, and 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 experiencing those emotions, those highs and lows of a game, of a contest. Sport actually teaches you how to, deal and handle your emotions in extreme situations. And what we what we love about sport is the passion that it elicits and that it brings out of the the individual, and also the observer. But at the same time, we always ask that that individual who's exuding all of that passion and emotion that we're all observing and watching and enjoying, then we say, okay, now control yourself. and
Yeah.
and and sometimes, you just don't get it right. And but instead of looking at that as a moment, it definitely was a moment of lapse in judgment and not having full control of our emotions, and reacting to a comment that Jordan had made the day before, calling us undeserving champions, and uh, that really stung. Now, 30 years later, looking back on it, should we have been bigger in that moment? Absolutely, we should have. But we wasn't, and that's part of the growth process now, that hopefully becomes a teachable moment.
But how would I say, when confronted by a media event like that documentary, and when asked, you didn't harden down, you didn't avoid it. You went right to things like you just said to me. And that's growth. I want to also share with our guests that you played a very, very helpful and constructive role in my life when I was a producer of the film Amazing Grace, about Aretha Franklin making the album of that name in 1972, February, in Los Angeles. And for all kinds of reasons, which we don't have to go into, that film had been delayed for many years, and there were negotiations going on with Aretha, uh, but we hadn't released the film, and then she unfortunately passed away. And her family, her estate, her niece Sabrina Owens, uh, I learned that you had very, very warm relations with the Franklin family, and you were very helpful to me in realizing that film, which I every time I see the credits, I know there's a thanks to you in there, but I see my wife and my daughters credited, and I just love so much what Aretha Franklin represented. How did you come to know her? How did you get to uh, acquainted, and what did she mean to your life?
You know, when I first got to Detroit, and as you know, Detroit, Chicago, being sister cities, in the music space, I-94, and you know, my mom, being an activist, at, early in life, in bringing us into activism and politics as a family. Um, the as the staple singers, and Aretha, and everyone was going back and forth from Detroit to Chicago. My mom was a huge Aretha Franklin, fan, and fortunately enough for myself, uh, my mom had also developed a relationship, unbeknownst to me, with Mayor Coleman Young. And so when I got to Detroit, um, the Mayor Coleman Young and I, we bonded, spent a lot of time together, and then you know I met Aretha, and when I met Aretha, I was, again, I was 19. I had just turned 20 in Detroit, and really didn't know much of anything. I had never had a checkbook in my life. I didn't know how to pay bills. I didn't know. And fortunately enough for me, you know, Aretha and her family adopted me as kind of their own, um, helping me just navigate through my first couple of years in Detroit. And we became extremely close. Um, you know, we would we talked politics and activism more than anything. And I remember I organized my first No Crime Day in Detroit in 1986. Um, and we marched down Woodward, and we asked for everyone in the city to, you know, have a day of peace. And Aretha was very instrumental in helping me put that together. The mayor was there. We had a No Crime Day dinner, and I'll never forget. I have a picture of me, her, and my mom, and it was the picture that we always wanted. And Tommy Hearns photobombed us. So it's a picture of Tommy, my mom, and Aretha, and myself. And we had been waiting because it wasn't like we all had camera phones back then, so you couldn't do a retake. So we didn't know that he had photobombed us, and until we actually got the picture, and it was like, oh man. So, but it's one of those pictures that I'll remember forever, that we have framed. And uh,
Ah,
Rita was, she was everything uh, to us at that time, and then she introduced me to Clive Davis, and when
ah,
she introduced me to Clive, I'll never forget. She said, this is someone that you can trust, and I want you to meet and know Clive, and here we are today.
wow, wow. Well, you certainly, how would I say, connecting with Aretha doesn't surprise me in light of what I learned about her politics. And you probably remember, I can't remember the lady's name, but Aretha had a woman who worked with her kind of on a quiet basis for all of her philanthropic giving. And I was sitting with Carlton Pearson at the funeral, when a funeral at which you gave a beautiful eulogy, and I know the family was very effusive about that. Uh, they spoke to me about it just afterwards. But the uh, Carlton and I were sitting there, and he said, "This lady is the person who Aretha had give out all the philanthropic money because she's so political and she's so generous." And the Reverend William Barber, who's a good friend of mine, I've done many things with, and when I did a conference in Detroit, he was my keynote speaker. Reverend Barber said to me afterwards, "That lady got the biggest cheer of the entire day." And I can't remember her name, but I'll go back. I have a video of the entire ceremony that was given to me. But it's there was so much depth. I mean, it's I don't know if it's mysterious or surprising or anything, because when you feel Aretha in that musical career, you know it's coming from some deep place. It just can't be disembodied. That spirit is very powerful. But Aretha was so politically conscious. I remember once meeting Elton John, and he was just reverent about how much she had supported him in a lot of his endeavors, particularly related to AIDS. So that, how would I say, you're a very talented man, but you were very fortunate to be able to cross paths with her and, how I say, energize one another. Tell me a little bit about your mother. I know you named a philanthropic organization, Mary's Court. About her, I was not aware that she was an activist. Can you share with us a little bit more about her and her legacy?
So my mom, Mary Thomas, they actually made a movie after her called A Mother's Courage, where Alfred Woodward, Alfred Woodward won an Emmy for it. And actually, the actor Leon played my big brother in it, Lord Henry. Um, it was you know, there's a street named after my mom in Chicago on Holman and Jackson, and called Mary Thomas Way. And my mom was she worked with Fred Hampton in the neighborhood. She was one of the people that helped serve the free breakfast. I received free breakfast. Um, she also worked with, believe it or not, a lot of the gang members, as we still do work today with the gang members in terms of moving them out of criminal activity and moving them into business and community work. And my mom marched with Martin Luther King in Chicago. And actually, when Martin Luther King moved to Chicago on the West Side, he actually moved in 3 blocks from my house. I lived on Congress and Holman, and he moved in on Hamlin. And you know, my mom just always made sure that you know we were there. We had no babysitter, so every time she went to March, she took her boys and her girls with her. And so, my mom was very popular in Chicago for her activism. And again, they made a movie about her, um, and when I got to Detroit, again, that's how it all came together. Most people think that um, it, people knew me for basketball, but I was at that time I was more well known for being Mary Thomas's son than Isaiah Thomas, the basketball player.
Wow, that's fantastic. Let me ask you about my home city of Detroit and place where you've been very active. When you pray at night for Detroit now and going forward, what would you like to see happen to invigorate and fortify and strengthen that community?
My whole life's work and mission has been to uplift the poor, and I grew up in extreme poverty. There's the poverty line, and then there's that line below poverty, and that was the line that the Census Bureau didn't count. That's where I was, and I know how difficult that can be. I know how compromised, you know, people in that situation are. So I always pray for the poor and the underserved communities, and pray that they get access uh, to mainstream where they can be productive. Um, that's my biggest hope.
Well, how would I say? We've been talking about, how would I say, a portrait, Muhammad Ali, Fred Hampton, Aretha Franklin, your mother, yourself. I'm getting, I'm, starting to understand the the power that you have been in your life. And when you said to me earlier in this conversation about that emotion, and then what you might call channeling or controlling that emotion, when we were talking about time on the basketball floor, I'm understanding more about your gifts, but more about where your intensity comes from. And I remember was very awkward for me. I was obviously a Caucasian in Detroit, which was the numerical minority, but the power majority. And then I was in Boston when I think you and the Celtics, it would probably been about 1987, where they won the game. And I remembered that you characterized what you might call the stereotyping or othering of how white basketball players, and there were many in the starting five of the Boston Celtics at that time, were viewed as hardworking and earnest and, how I say, like they had deserved their skill, whereas the phrase something to the effect of black people just dribbled out of the womb and were talented. And when you challenge that, I remember, because of all the tensions, I'd been in Boston going back to the mid 70s with the Garrity busing decisions, and my little brother in the Big Brother program was African American. But I just felt like you made the clouds part and made the NBA and the world look at a consciousness that was foul. And I wondered where you got the strength to do that. And I'm through this discussion, I'm understanding better where that came from.
That definitely came from my mom and also my dad. Um, and I never forget. You bring up busing. 1974. I'll never forget this day. Imprinted on my brain like it was yesterday. Uh, I'm walking out of the door, trying to get to school, and I don't want to be late for school. And my mom literally grabs me by the collar, by the back of my neck, by the collar, and pulls me back and goes, "Sit down. You need to watch this." And I was like, "Mom, I'm gonna be late for school." And she's like, "You need to watch this." On the news, they're talking about busing in Boston in 1974, and a Caucasian woman gets on, and she is, just really going off about how she doesn't want her kids going to school, being on a bus or around, and she used the N word. And she used the N word several times in the interview. And and then right after that, my mom said this. This is why we root for Bill Russell and the Boston Celtics. Have a good day at school.
Whoa, whoa, wow. Well, I'll share with you my experience in Boston, where I go to volunteer for the Big Brother program. And the gentleman, his name was Marcel, that ran it, says to me, "You're from Detroit, and we have a lot of young people who are black, but it's very hard given the tensions around the busing. Would you be amenable to becoming a Big Brother for an African American child?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." Not, like I'd go to these gyms and I meet the kids, and if you connect with somebody, they kind of then have you meet the parents, and it gets paired up. And his name is Lazar Franklin, and my little brother were still very close contact. But the episode looked like, to my eyes, on a day, what you saw from Boston on television was when I took my little brother to Fenway Park for the first time. And there was Jim Rice was African American left field. George Scott, the boomer, was on first base, and Louis Tiant, pitcher, was a person of color. The rest of the team was white. And we were sitting in right center field, and a bunch of other fans started throwing ice at us, like they would take the ice out of their drink and they'd throw the cubes at us. And it, I didn't, Lazar was a fourth grader at the time, and so I went up to the usher and I said, "Are you going to let this go on?" And he looked at me and he said, "What do you want me to do, man?" And I just kind of picked up, and Lazar and I went, found other seats somewhere else, and weren't similarly harassed. But after the game, Lazar wanted to get autographs. And we went down where the players come out, and we're standing there, and George Scott was the first person to come out, black first baseman. And Lazar runs up with his little paper and pen, and a little girl ran up to George Scott, a black man, and the little girl said, "Sign mine before," and uses the N word.
Mm-hmm.
And George Scott looks down and he says, "Okay, wait a minute. I need to know who are the parents with these two children." I raise my hand, and he starts talking to me like I'm with the white girl because I'm Caucasian. And I said, "No, I'm with Lazar." He says, "Oh, okay." The other parents started coming up and attacking George Scott for objecting, and the N word was flying around. I thought I was on Mars. I couldn't believe it. But I was getting acquainted with those tensions, but I just couldn't believe that. And I come from a family in the Detroit area. My dad had a medical practice that was largely black, and most of the employees of his medical practice were black. And he was very involved in the music scene in Detroit as a jazz pianist. But Isaiah, Boston blew my circuits. It was just so far off.
You know what I find? What I find interesting is that as I've gotten older and had an opportunity to travel outside of America and in other countries, and I'm sure you've had this experience also. When we travel outside of America, we never identify as black, white, brown, people of color. I mean, when you go to another country and you're an American, that's it. You know. But if you went to another country and they say, "Hey, you know, where are you from?" and you go, "Hey, I'm white."
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
they laugh at you. But
yeah.
I find it I find it interesting that the only place that we really play this black, white, red, yellow, brown color game is in this country. And that should tell us something.
Mm-hmm. Yes. One of the scholars that worked with me on my Detroit conference was the emeritus professor Peter Temin, uh, who wrote a book coming out of that conference, which I'll get you a copy of. It's called The Vanishing Middle Class. And Peter Temin said that what has happened is that we have this economy that's increasingly a service economy, and the people who are well paid understand knowledge intensive service value added. but they've taken the rungs out of the education ladder. And what's interesting is only about, let's say, 20% of the population is in that high end services. 80% is caught in the lower areas. And what Timmons' book is about is how, by creating black white rivalry and hostility, when of that 80%, only about 8 of that 80% that's in the lower rung are people of color, or people who are African American. And so you would think that 80% would all vote to put the rungs in the ladder and all climb up to that higher, more, how I say, thoroughly compensated part of the professional spectrum. But when the polarization takes place, these people vote against their economic self-interest in order to be different from the black people, and the entire system becomes dysfunctional. And that's Peter Timmons' premise, is that we are destroying ourselves with this false rivalry, and that our nation has withered in terms of its capacity to rise to the challenges of globalization and technology and what have you. So I think that that poison that you described, that is unmasked when you travel abroad, or that poison which creates very, very severe disorientation. We've had a child care professional from the Caribbean, and she came to work with us, and how she's treated here is not anything like how she's treated in St. Lucia, where she came from. So I don't know, Isaiah. How do we've identified the dysfunction, the hideousness, the inhumanity, but how do we heal it?
Well,
what is your vision there?
You heal it just by being honest, and the constructed box of race, class, stereotype. America has to rid itself of these constructed boxes. You know, we asked the question earlier. Can can you govern a society preaching equality, but having race, the constructed boxes of race, as your foundational piece? And if you're not willing to change and adapt, then that foundational piece is starting to crumble. Because we all live, I like to say, we all live on the hyphen right now. We're all mixed with something. There's no pure anything anymore. Mm-hmm. You know, so everyone's on the hyphen, and you know there's some truths that this country has to recognize and deal with. You know that, and then you can move forward. But these are realistic and hard truths, and I think the international community that looks at America understands that there are some truths that America needs to deal with.
Yes, without question. And hopefully that continues to be a significant part of the agenda that you referred to as new economic thinking, new human thinking, new societal thinking. We've got to transcend this rut, this hideous mindset. Well, Isaiah, I want to say I felt an exhilaration when I saw you pass that ball to Vinnie Johnson, and I felt gratitude when I encountered your help with the Amazing Grace Project. But none of those beautiful moments compares in my heart with this conversation today. You are a really great man, and I want to thank you for being here with me.
Well, thank you, brother. And I'm honored to be here with you, walking this journey.
Let's come back before too long when the world gives us some more stimulants and keep walking this journey together. But we can come back and share with this audience more of your insights in the not too distant future. Thank you again.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
And check out more from the Institute for New Economic Thinking at ineteconomics.org.